Chapter 18. Faces. Butler Joe did not know why he looked a little arrogant today, said with a leathery smile, "Young master, this matter in the mansion, the old madam said that I am still in charge of it." The young master's name was deliberately stretched by housekeeper Joe, and the meaning of disrespect inside was displayed in an unmistakable way. Fan Xian smiled at the hint of contempt in the other party's eyes, although he had never felt sorry for himself because of his illegitimate status, but it was rare to run into this kind of look at the eyes of sinners, and he could not help but feel slightly offended. Seeing that things are not good, there is a smart maid secretly slipped away to find the old madam. The other maids and subordinates, on the other hand, were nervously watching the scene. Although there were two houses in the clear sense, everyone knew that young Master Fan Xian's identity was actually not very honorable, and that all of the applications for the Tanyu Port Farewell House were plucked from Kyoto, from the hands of that second mistress. It was precisely because of this that the second mistress's beloved butler Zhou had dared to be so disrespectful to this young master. After all, in everyone's mind, the one who will inherit Sananbo's huge family fortune in the future could only be that young master in Kyoto, not this 12-year-old boy with a lovely smile in front of him. Although the subordinates had always respected and loved Fan Xian, at such a time of camping, no one dared to risk offending the second mistress and stand on Fan Xian's side. Only the personal maid, CC, held Fan Xian's hand tightly. Fan Xian was well aware of the considerations of these subordinates. It wasn't easy for anyone who wanted to live a better life, so he didn't feel sad or chilled, but just inclined his head and looked curiously at the ill-faced steward Zhou in front of him, thinking that he had always been at peace, so why had he finally been unable to help himself? Butler Zhou was the second butler of Count Sinan's mansion in Kyoto, and because he had made some minor mistakes in Kyoto, he had been driven to the distant and remote Danzhou harbor. But this butler Zhou didn't feel that his life was henceforth far away from the prosperity of Kyoto, nor did he feel sad because of it. Earl Sinan's main wife had died many years ago, and the second wife had given birth to a son 7 years ago, so the water had risen, plus the second wife's mother's family had some background, so she was about to ascend to the throne. At such a critical time, Butler Zhou, who was the second mistress's beloved, came to Danzhou, naturally without any good intentions. In order to fulfill his mission, so he was very careful to manage the Earl's residence. He had special respect for the old madam, he was also kind to his subordinates, and he seldom interfered in other people's duties, only that every time he saw that little bitch who caused himself to be exiled in disguise, he could not help but reveal his true thoughts. But for some reason, he was a little afraid of that boy who was only in his teens. Because no matter where he went, he seemed to be able to see that boy's slightly smiling face and those clear, transparent eyes. That face was clean and beautiful, but if you found that face accompanying you at all times from the moment you woke up, that feeling would be weird. When Butler Zhou greeted his subordinates with a kind face, little Fan Xian's pretty face was hidden among the flowers, looking at him with fascination. When Butler Zhou frowned and carefully inspected the accounts, little Fan Xian's clean face was resting on the window sill of the account room, innocently looking at him. When Butler Zhou respectfully and incomparably reported to the old madam, little Fan Xian's adorable face was gently leaning on the side of the old madam, full of countless curiosities, looking at him with countless curiosities. After a few months like this, housekeeper Zhou felt like he was going crazy. No matter if he opened or closed his eyes, he could see that clean, cute and harmless little face, like a ghost's face floating in an ethereal white mist. If it wasn't a ghost's face, how could it be so beautiful and so intently looking at him? He was already about to be unable to withstand this kind of mental pressure, and even began to be paranoid. Was it possible that the little boy knew that he was here to deal with him? But Steward Zhou immediately thought, this sinful seed is only a little bit older, how can he know those insidious things in the adult world? But why is he always looking at me? Why? Just like the current situation, obviously his words should make this little bastard feel humiliated. Why is he still able to laugh? Butler Zhou sneered, thinking that the matter of Tanyu is about to end. Why do I still have to suffer the anger of this little bitch? Fan Xian didn't know that his unbridled observation of the butler would cause the other party so much mental stress, and of course even if he knew, he wouldn't be more apologetic. He was just curious about what kind of tactics that Aunt in Kyoto would use against him. But seeing housekeeper Zhou use his first mate to brush himself off by lecturing him, Fan Xian's mood had begun to gloom, and after hearing that unctuous word young master, the smile on his face began to slowly converge. I heard that young master kicked a big mate out of the mansion some years ago. That's also too much nonsense. Butler Zhou looked as if he did not see the youngster's face turn sour, and still continued to speak with a hint of disdain on his face. In the future, the young master is still young in age, so he should worry less about these matters in the residence. Fan Xian smiled. Are you warning me to be more peaceful? Housekeeper Zhou said he didn't dare, but his tone was arrogant. How dare I? It's just that before I came, the second mistress told me that the young master was young, so I should take care of him. Aren't you afraid that I'll slap you in the face as the young master? Fan Xian asked curiously. Butler Zhou laughed, stroked the not-so-many whiskers under his chin, and said, although the young master this has lost his mother since he was a child, and is less disciplined, we all know that, but after all, he has also been well-read since he was a young boy, so how could he treat his subordinates so harshly? He looked at the beautiful teenager in front of him in his teens, and secretly laughed inwardly. Just such a small child, actually want to pose the master's spectrum in front of me. Oh. It was at this time that Fan Xian seemed to have remembered his illegitimate identity, snapped out of it, and turned to leave. Although the maid secretly fought for the young master, they watched as there was no conflict and felt relieved for Fan Xian. Cici held Fan Xian's hand and her eyes began to get wet. Thinking that the young master was really pitiful, and fearing that he would get angry, she secretly looked with her remaining light and realized that Fan Xian's eyes were full of serenity, and only then did she let go of her heart. Fan Xian held Cici's hand and entered the house, moved 2 benches and placed them in front of the door, letting Cici sit on one bench and carrying the other to the garden. The subordinates and maids had not yet dispersed, and housekeeper Zhou was still reminiscing about his earlier heroics. Fan Xian placed the bench in front of housekeeper Zhou. The people next to him found it strange, and housekeeper Zhou didn't understand what it meant, and when he was about to ask a question, little Fan Xian had already stepped on the bench and stood up. At this time, Fan Xian was only 12 years old, and was not very tall. With the addition of a stool, he was only about the same height as Butler Zhou. The crowd was perplexed, wondering what he was doing standing up on the stool, and at this very moment, they only saw Fan Xian raise his right hand to his mouth and puffed out 2 mouthfuls of hot air, then raised it high. What are you going to do? The words were still stuck in Butler Zhou's mouth, not having had time to spew out along with the spittle. Fan Xian's small hand had already swung backward and slapped forward viciously. Splat! With a crunching sound, housekeeper Zhou was slapped to the ground by this slap. A reddish slap mark appeared on his face, and a trace of blood seeped out from the corner of his mouth. His entire person was blindsided, and he absolutely could not have imagined that this child would actually have so much strength, and that this child would actually really dare to hit himself. Little Fan Xian jumped down from the stool, rubbed his wrists, took a side handkerchief from a small maid next to him and wiped his hands, looked at housekeeper Zhou who was on the ground covering his face and moaning, and said softly, being well read in poetry is also hitting people. Although I don't mistreat my subordinates, I'm happy to let you know what it means to be a playboy's doings.